Hi, this is Tony Northrup for TrainSignal, and in this video lesson I'm going to describe lots of different authentication mechanisms that might be covered on your SSCP certification exam. The first thing I'd like to do is just to review the difference between authentication and authorization. Authentication is proving who you are. It's identifying yourself, maybe by saying your name or typing a username, and then proving it in some additional way, which could be showing a picture ID or typing a password or scanning your retina. Authentication proves who you are, but authorization shows what you can do. Authorization is the process of verifying that you're allowed access to something or you're allowed to perform a specific task. So at the airport, you authenticate yourself by showing your ID, and you authorize yourself by showing your boarding pass. On a network, you might log in with a username and password to authenticate yourself, but then when you actually access a file or other network resource, the server goes through the authorization process to make sure that now that it knows who you are, that you're also allowed to do what it is you're trying to do. Now, typing your password is the most common way to authenticate yourself. Holding up a picture ID is another way. But there are dozens of different ways that people authenticate themselves every day. They fall into three main categories: something you know, something you have, and something you are. So passwords are something you know. Picture ID, because it's measuring your face and what it looks like, is something you are. If you authenticate yourself with just one of these things, that's called single-factor authentication. And that's more secure than just identifying yourself. But it's not as secure as dual-factor authentication. With dual-factor authentication, you combine two different types of authentication, usually from different families. So you wouldn't provide something you know and something you know. You wouldn't type both a password and a PIN. Instead, you would type a password and you'd insert a smart card, something you have. So let's go over some common authentication mechanisms. The most common by far is passwords. We're just typing passwords all day, I feel like. Every website needs you to have one now. That's a good thing. People are familiar with passwords. Everybody, from the time you're little now, knows that you can type a username and password and authenticate. It's also really easy. You can do it with any keyboard or touchscreen. So you don't need any special hardware. You don't need to train people. Passwords are just automatic. Everybody knows how to do it nowadays. And that's one of the reasons that they continue to be really common, even though they're not a great form of authentication. I think the single biggest problem with passwords is they're just really hard to remember. Well, okay, they're not always hard to remember, but people work out tricks to make them easy to remember. Like, I'll pick my dog's name as a password because I'm not going to forget my dog's name. That's easy to remember. Or people have to get a PIN and they decide they're going to make it their birthday or the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, something like that. So passwords aren't always hard to remember because we've developed these little tricks to help us remember passwords that we make up. But the problem is everybody comes up with the same tricks to remember their passwords. We all figured out 1, 2, 3, 4 is easy to remember. 1, 1, 1, 1 is easy to remember. Our birthday is easy to remember. And because we all use these same tricks, the bad guys have figured it out. And that makes passwords easy to guess. If you do manage to get a complex password, you're probably not going to be able to remember 250 of them. That's how many passwords I have. It's actually more than that. I keep a long list of passwords for every website and everywhere I have to authenticate. Hundreds of passwords. It's impossible for any normal human to remember that many. So I don't know how it is we expect people to remember all these hundreds of different passwords and to make them complex. So these are a couple of the challenges with passwords. Another challenge is that if you get a user to actually use a complex password, something other than their dog's name, well, very well might forget it. And when somebody forgets their password, well, they can't get their job done. They're unproductive, which means the company is paying them to do nothing. So the user is frustrated, the company is losing money. So this puts us in a conflict. Allow users to have easy passwords that they can remember, force users to have complex passwords, but tolerate users forgetting their passwords and needing to reset them on a regular basis. require users to have unique passwords for every different system, at the risk that a single password would allow access to hundreds of different systems, or make them do all sorts of different passwords, in which case they'll definitely have to write them down somewhere, and which might be easily discovered by an attacker. There are some variations on the traditional password, and those are PINs, usually 4-digit numbers, so they can be longer or shorter. These are really commonly used with credit cards. And passphrases. Passphrases are, it's an effort that's been around for 20 or 30 years, but instead of just having 8 or 9 character password, you come up with a phrase and you type the whole thing in. So your passphrase could be 30 characters. It could be, I really like my dog Sandy, instead of just my dog's name, Sandy. And passphrases, right now, they're pretty much uncrackable using dictionary attacks because they're not that common. Whereas the name Sandy would certainly come up in a dictionary attack. The phrase, I like my dog Sandy, almost certainly is not in there. So right now, you can use a passphrase. It's easy to remember. It's moderately easy to type, assuming you're not on a touch screen. And password dictionaries can't get it, so it sounds great, right? Well, here's the problem. If we start encouraging people to use passphrases, well, they're going to do the same things they did with passwords. They're going to start choosing easy-to-guess common phrases. So you know there'll be thousands of people choosing show me the money as their passphrase. Are you talking to me? Hasta la vista, baby. They're all going to be the same passwords repeated over and over again. And pretty soon these passphrases are going to make their way into password dictionaries. So right now, passphrases are a nice alternative that is really difficult to crack with a password attack, but it's exercising security by obscurity. And that is never a good approach in the long run. Because passwords are so common, attackers have developed a whole array of different ways to crack your passwords. The simplest is very physical. It's just shoulder surfing. Somebody's going to type their password and you just look to see which buttons their fingers are pressing. As a good guy, as a white hat, I always immediately turn around as soon as I see somebody typing a password. Also, by the way, if I have to type somebody's password, like if I'm trying to connect to their Wi-Fi, I usually offer my device. I'll say, hey, what's your password? Would you like to type it? Sometimes they'll just tell me and I'll type it. Maybe they don't care. But at the same time, I try to protect people's privacy whenever possible. Another really simple password attack is keylogging, and keylogging can be done at both a software and a hardware level. The hardware level is maybe the scariest one because it's essentially undetectable. You take this little piece of hardware that goes between the keyboard cable and the USB port or PS2 port on the back of the computer. It's just a little adapter, could be 1/4 of an inch long. It's really tiny and basically imperceptible unless you're physically checking where your cable connects to the computer every day. Now, the challenge with keylogging for an attacker is that they need physical access to your computer at least twice. They need physical access to install the keylogger, which really just takes a second, and then to retrieve it again so they can pull everything you've typed off of it. Now, you're probably typing your password with a keyboard, right? That means that the keylogger will have your password typed in it, as well as every website you've typed and every email you've written. Pretty scary stuff, basically indetectable by modern hardware. Physical security is the answer to it. Another approach is some people will type their password using a mouse. They'll use an on-screen keyboard and they'll click each of the different letters, or they'll use a touch screen to touch the letters rather than typing onto a physical keyboard. This can help block keylogging. If you're really paranoid, and I've done this before on kiosks and computers that I don't trust, it's not foolproof, but it's better than nothing, I'll type part of my password with the keyboard and then I'll switch to an alternate input method, such as an on-screen keyboard. That way they wouldn't be able to capture the entire thing through the keylogging mechanism. Another common but now outdated attack is sniffing. Sniffing is the process of pulling data off of a network. Now, back in the olden days, let's say the mid-90s when I was first doing security work, email was pretty much accessed in clear text, and networks didn't have any inherent encryption. Back in the day, we didn't have what's called switches now. Switches, a network switch, sends data only to the computer that's meant to receive it. Back then, we had hubs, and hubs were cheaper. And every packet you sent on the network went to every computer on the network, including its destination server. But that meant that if you had physical access to a network, you could put your network adapter into promiscuous mode. And it's not quite what it sounds like. Promiscuous mode just means that the network adapter is going to receive every packet rather than the packets that are destined just for it. So you could fire up a tool and just watch it collect passwords. And every time somebody checked their email, you'd get their username and password, and then you could impersonate them. Nowadays, every server that I know of, every email server, Facebook, Instant Messenger, all this stuff is encrypted. So sniffing it, you just get a bunch of garbage and you really can't figure it out. Sniffing is no longer really a viable way to get people's passwords, but it has been historically common. Phishing nowadays is a much more common approach. Phishing is pretending to be some legitimate service that the user wants, collecting their information and then sending them on their way. Maybe you redirect them to the final site, or maybe you just show an error message so they don't know that anything actually happened. For example, it's really common to do this with banking websites. I might go to my bank's website and it will prompt me for my account number and a password. Well, how do I know it's my bank's website and not a bad guy who's made a website look exactly like it? It's incredibly easy to make a website look like any other website. Well, that's the process of phishing, and it works really well. Now, one common countermeasure to phishing is to use secure HTTP, HTTPS. This authenticates the server to you, and it encrypts all the information, so that's a good start. But honestly, that can be bypassed pretty easily too. So phishing has been a real problem, and web browsers are starting to build their own countermeasures, and they'll warn you if you're visiting a phishing site. If you have the ability to try a set of user credentials, you can use a dictionary attack or a brute force attack. Now what I mean is, if you can type somebody's username and password, for example, if you can go to the Facebook page and log in as your friend, well, you can guess their password. And if you know them well, you might be able to guess it in 2 or 3 guesses. If you don't know them well at all, it might take you 10 million guesses using a tool, obviously, that would iterate this automatically, because that would be a lot to type. Dictionary attacks and brute force attacks are a little bit different. Dictionary attacks go through a list of commonly used passwords. So it has every single dog name in there. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and password with the @ sign instead of the A, and thousands, tens of thousands, millions of other commonly used passwords. What they do is they take an actual user database where the passwords are stored in clear text, and they just throw it into a dictionary. And they've done this millions of times over. If you search the web, you can find dictionaries of commonly used passwords, and then you plug them into a tool that submits them to a server for authentication. Brute force attacks are a little different. Brute force attacks start with basically the letter A, and then they try B, and then they try C, until they get to AA and then AB, and they just keep trying every possible combination, including special characters and numbers and capital letters, and they will eventually try every single word, every single complex password. And I guess if you let it go long enough, it would write the full works of William Shakespeare too. But there are billions and billions of possible combinations, and this takes some time. So brute force attacks will always succeed. Dictionary attacks won't always succeed. If you write a complex password that's not in the dictionary won't guess your password. But a brute force attack will eventually succeed. The question is, how long? So we try to make our passwords long enough that a brute force attack won't be able to guess it in any sort of reasonable time. If a brute force attack is going to take 1,000 years, well, I'm not going to sweat it. I know my password could be guessed in 1,000 years of brute force attacks, but I'm not going to be around when it happens, so help the person who gets into my account with that technique. So the best countermeasure to a dictionary attack is a complex password. And the best countermeasure for a brute force attack is a long password. So what we do is we use long and complex passwords, and that's the best way to protect against these very common attacks. Another good countermeasure is just slowing down the rate that somebody can try passwords. You can go to any website that requires you to type in a username or password nowadays, and if you do it more than 5 times, sometimes 3 times, it'll say, all right, stop, you've got to reset your password now. You've tried it too many times. It will lock you out. On Windows PCs, if you create an account on the local computer, it will allow you to type your password, I think, 3 times, and then stuff starts to get really slow. After you type your password incorrectly the 3rd time, it makes you wait like 30 seconds before you can type it again. It even says welcome, even though it's not really welcoming you. And then you type it wrong again, it slows down a little bit more. So by the time you're typing your password the 10th or 20th time, you are waiting a long time between attempts. And this is an effort to stop both dictionary attacks and brute force attacks. In enterprise environments, administrators often enable account lockout. And account lockout prevents an account from being accessed, usually for 30 minutes, sometimes indefinitely until an administrator unlocks an account. It locks it out after a certain number of incorrect password guesses. So if somebody guesses your password 5 times, that's it. Nobody can log in. You, with your legitimate password, can't log in until that account becomes unlocked. Because it's better to prevent the legitimate user from accessing their account than to allow a non-legitimate user to gain elevated privileges using your account. Social attacks are a pretty new but increasingly common way to get somebody's password. With a social attack, an attacker uses information gathered from you, often on social networks, and uses it to guess your password. Because, as I said earlier, people have a hard time remembering passwords, so we make our password our dog's name or something we can remember. So you can figure out somebody's dog's name and then use it to try to guess their password. For this reason, you really want to keep this kind of information about yourself secret. So how do you do that? Well, don't friend everybody in the world. Set your privacy settings so that people you don't know can't see the stuff that you post. If you get that friend request from the cute girl or guy with a nice smile, don't just accept it. Check them out a little bit. If you don't actually know them, don't accept their friend request because it's probably a fake picture. It's probably a big ugly fat guy who just wants to steal your account information so they can take money from you. More classic, kind of old school variation on the social attack is social engineering. Kevin Mitnick made this pretty famous, and he spends some time in jail for it. In fact, you can call a guy up and say, hey, this is IT. We're having a problem with your account. Can you give me your username and password, please? And, well, nowadays people are a little more savvy. But back in the days, people would be like, yes, my username and password are, and they would just tell you. It was that easy. You could just ask. People are so polite and they want to be helpful, and social engineering would kind of abuse that. I'll step back to social attacks to just give you one more warning. Because passwords are often forgotten, there are mechanisms in most systems to allow resetting of passwords. You can, for example, type in your mother's maiden name and your first dog's name and the city in which you were born, your father's middle name. There are all these security questions that they ask you. And if you type in the right 3 questions, often, they will reset your password to whatever it is you want. So, another variation on the social attack is to gather this private information about somebody. You can figure out where they were born from Facebook. You can look through their Facebook relationships and probably figure out what their mother's name is, including their mother's maiden name. Just look at their grandparents' names. You can figure this sort of private information out, answer those security questions, and reset somebody's password. It's another good reason to keep your information private and tell other people to keep their information private. Because we're all on the same team. We're trying to stop thieves and hackers. So the more people who learn these best practices, the less success they'll have, and the less we'll have to worry about it. Now, the next block here, reuse attacks. I made this term up. I don't know that there's a proper term for it, but because passwords are hard to remember, people use the same passwords over and over and over again. So they use the same password on their Gmail and on their Facebook and on the corporate account. So guess what? If you can hack into somebody's Facebook account, then you can get into their Gmail and you can get into their corporate account. Now, Facebook, Gmail, corporate accounts, those all do a pretty good job of protecting their passwords. But let's say you set up a photography forum and you invite somebody to it. They log in, they set up a username and password for themselves. Well, the owner of that website can get your password. And if they're a little bit savvy, they'll take your username and password and try it in every other website that you might use. So ask yourself, have you ever used the same password on more than one site? And if the answer is yes, ask yourself, do you trust the administrators of that site to protect your password that you use on all those other sites? Do you trust them? Do you know them? Do you know what security measures they're using? Are they infallible? Not only do you trust them, but do you think somebody else might be able to hack into their systems and get your password? Well, I think we're all guilty of reusing a password at some point, and specifically of reusing passwords in websites that we might not trust. This can blow everything open for you, so just be careful about it. Complex passwords aren't enough. If you're using the same password in more than one place, well, your risk is multiplying. One of them needs to get hacked for you to lose everything. Before I go into rainbow tables, I need to describe a little bit about how passwords are typically stored in a database. Now, in old school, poorly created password systems, we, meaning us database administrators, used to just put somebody's username and password in clear text. This makes authentication really easy, right? Because somebody types in their username and password and you just set up a query if username equals this, and you just set up a query where if there is any row in the table where both the username and the password match the criteria specified, then you can authenticate the user. That's as easy as it can possibly get. The challenge is that if somebody can gain access to that database, they can get everybody's password. It's really easy, right? So nowadays we do things a little bit differently. We use hashing. When somebody creates a new user account, they provide a username and password for themselves. We then make a hash of that password. And to understand hashing, you need to know a little bit about cryptography. But cryptography is this crazy math where you can take a regular word like Sandy, my dog's name, and turn it into a seemingly random set of letters and numbers. This is called the hash, and you store that hash. Now, the thing about hashing is it's always the same. So Sandy will always turn into the same set of letters and numbers. Another characteristic of hashing is that it's not bidirectional. Sandy will turn into the same hash, but you can't take the hash and get Sandy back out of it. You'd have to do a brute force attack. You'd have to keep trying combinations and hashing them until you found out that Sandy equaled this hash. I'm about to get to rainbow tables. We're getting close now. Now, here's where rainbow tables come in. If you use hashing, the database has a list of usernames and then the hash of people's passwords. If you get this list of hashes, well, you still don't know people's passwords. You'd have to perform a brute force attack to gain every single password, calculating hashes every single time until you found a hash that matches. A rainbow table is a password dictionary that's been pre-hashed for you. How convenient. You have this list of hashes and the original password, and then you just need to search the database for the hashes, and you can look up the original password. So a rainbow table is a way to convert a hashed list of passwords to the original plain text passwords, allowing you to then authenticate as that user. Wow, after saying all that, I'm really realizing just how much I hate passwords. Well, here's a better alternative, smart cards. Smart cards, well, they're smarter than a regular card, I guess. It's not like they're using tools or doing math for you or anything, but these smart cards are better than a business card. They store a little certificate in them. And this certificate has been issued to you by some certificate publisher, public key infrastructure, which we'll learn more about later. And it identifies you uniquely. And somebody authenticating you can check out your smart card certificate and know that it was issued by a trusted authority. Smart cards generally are tamper-proof to protect the certificate. So you can't steal the certificate from the smart card, but you can put some information in it and have it process it and get some information out. If you try to get the information from the smart card, well, they're generally designed in such a way that they'll become mangled and then they will just be completely useless. In other words, you put that certificate in, it's not coming out. But you can put a little challenge to the smart card and have it prove that it has a valid certificate. Smart cards are something you have security. Passwords, something you know. Smart cards, something you have. If an authentication mechanism required only a smart card to authenticate you, well, somebody could just steal your smart card and then they'd be you, right? That would be single-factor authentication, and it's not very secure. Dual-factor authentication is much better, and with smart cards, the most common way to provide dual-factor authentication is to use them with a PIN. I don't know why a PIN instead of a password. I guess because PINs are easier to type and remember, and they figure most of the security is being carried by the smart card anyway. So you'd insert your smart card into a computer, or you'd wave it past a device if it's a proximity or RF-based smart card, and then you'd have to type in, say, a 4-digit PIN. The PIN is something you know, the smart card is something you have. Two different types of authentication make dual-factor authentication. Smart cards, they're great. They definitely improve security, but there are some requirements. You have to make these smart cards and distribute them to everybody in your organization. And don't underestimate what a pain that is. They also require this public key infrastructure, so you need servers that are issuing the certificates. You also need to manage all of this, and oh my goodness, is this a major effort, because these smart cards, well, they're not designed to last forever. In fact, they always have a limited lifespan, so at some point you have to go collect the old cards and issue new cards. People are going to forget their cards, and then they're not going to be able to get access to the system, which means people are unproductive and they have to open a ticket to get another smart card. It's a real pain. So smart cards are a necessary evil for many organizations. If passwords aren't enough for you, smart cards are probably the next logical step, but there's going to be some cost involved, a lot, and users are going to be inconvenienced. So let's talk about attacks on smart cards. Now, I had this long list of attacks on passwords, largely because passwords have been around forever, so attackers have been thinking of better and better ways to attack them. With smart cards, there are really fewer options. You can just physically steal the smart card. It's pretty easy, right? Just grab it from the guy's pocket or threaten him and take it. You can also find a way to steal the certificate from the smart card. It's not so easy. You can't get it from the smart card. The smart card's not going to give it up. It stores it securely. But you could probably get it from the server, or maybe somebody emails the certificate to the guy and you can pull it from their email. But generally, if you're using smart cards, you're a little savvy about storing the certificate correctly too, so that's not always an easy option. You know, a more likely option is just to hack the server. There's some server somewhere that's authenticating people by smart cards, and there's another server that contains the configuration settings that say, like, oh, we need to authenticate these people with a smart card and a PIN. Change that setting so you don't require smart cards, or hack into the server so that every request it gets, it just automatically approves. These are the most likely ways to bypass smart card authentication. So what you need to take away from that is not, hey, I need to get into somebody's system. Thanks, Tony, for telling me how. No, I'm not giving you advice to hack. I'm giving you advice to protect your systems. What I'm saying is, if you go to use smart cards, you need to be really careful to protect those certificates. And you need to harden that server, because your smart card authentication server, well, if somebody can get to it, they can bypass all your security, which means protecting the server is just as important as issuing those smart cards. Also, your configuration servers are really important. This is something people overlook all the time. The systems that they use to manage the Active Directory or group policy or whatever infrastructure it is that's requiring smart cards, you can't just let somebody have access to that, or they'll just turn your smart cards off, right? Now let's talk about one-time passwords, OTP. One-time passwords are a big improvement on regular passwords. People don't have to remember them. They can't be easily guessed because they can only be used once. One-time passwords are generated by these little electronic devices that show you either a numeric or alphanumeric password that's constantly changing. It might change every time you log on, or it might change every minute. It might also be defined by a challenge that you get from a server. So the server could say, hey, type these 5 numbers into your one-time password device. And you type them in, and then the one-time password device processes that using some cryptographic math and spits out a response. This is the server's way of proving that you have that one-time password device. That's right, it's a something you have form of authentication. And as you'll see on the slide, it's often used with a PIN to provide dual-factor authentication, because PINs are what? Something you know. So these two types of one-time password devices are synchronous and asynchronous. Now, if you get a challenge from the server and you have to type something into the one-time password device to get out a unique one-time password, that's asynchronous. Asynchronous just meaning they're not synchronized. The server actually has to say, hey, this is the challenge that we're using today, for the password device to spit something back out. I think the more common mechanism are synchronous one-time password devices. With the synchronous one-time password device, you sync it up with the server, and they each agree on what time of day it is, and then they use that time of day to calculate the current one-time password. So your password is going to update, say, every minute, and the server on the other end also knows what your one-time password is for that exact minute. And you'll type it in, and the server will check it against what it thinks it is, and if they don't match up, you don't get authenticated. If they do match up, you get authenticated. Usually the server will cut you some slack, like if you type last minute's password or the next minute's password, it's going to let you in. This allows for the fact that clocks aren't completely synchronous. Like if your one-time password device hasn't been synced up for a couple of years, it might be slipping by a couple of seconds. You don't want to be rejected just because the server thought it was the next minute and your one-time password device thought it was the previous minute. So usually there's a little bit of leeway there, but it still provides a great deal of security. One-time passwords have some infrastructure requirement. You have to hand these physical devices out to everybody in your organization, and they can be a little pricey, especially if you're buying thousands or tens of thousands of these things. You also need some sort of specialized authentication server. Whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, it needs to be a piece of software that's designed specifically to work with the one-time password devices that you're using. In many cases, you'll also need a specialized authentication client. Now, with the synchronous one-time password, you could just type that in like a regular password, and it would be something you have. However, it would still only be single-factor authentication, right? Because you're not also typing in a PIN. So usually you need a little special dialog box that pops up and prompts you for both your one-time password and your PIN. That little special dialog box requires some specialized authentication client software. It's not going to work on your iPhone. It's not going to work on Facebook, for example. They're not set up that way. But in an enterprise, when you're logging on your Windows computer, you can replace that logon dialog box with whatever you want. So you need that extra client software, especially with the asynchronous type 1 type passwords where they need to get a challenge from the server that you type in. Well, it's got to have a way to show you that challenge, right? And I bet when you go to log onto your Windows PC, it doesn't show you a challenge number, right? No, you'd have to update the logon dialog box to get that challenge from the server. So on the left there, you see what could be an asynchronous type device. It has a method for the user to enter in some information, which is probably the challenge from the server. It could also be that he's entering in a PIN number and it is a synchronous device. But either way, because we can see that it has a method for the user entering in something, it could be used for the challenge response type asynchronous one-time password authentication. The device on the right is the more common type. This is synchronous. It's synced up with a server, and it's just going to show a different set of numbers every minute. These devices are a lot cheaper. They're smaller. The buttons don't break. They're pretty indestructible. You can just stick them on your keychain. I've used these for years at different organizations. How do you get around these one-time passwords if you're an attacker? Well, you steal the device, right? Of course, they always use dual-factor authentication with these things. You can't just steal the device and get into the network. You'd also have to get the guy's PIN. So you would need two separate methods to get in. You can also crack the cryptography. For example, on the synchronous devices, if you can figure out the certificate and what numbers the server is going to be generating for each different minute from here to forever, well, you're in, and you can bypass one-time passwords all you want. You might do that by hacking the server. That's probably the easiest way. But I suppose if you had a lot of computing power or you discovered a flaw in the cryptographic algorithm, well, you could crack the cryptography directly. But good luck doing that. I mean, the most likely option here is to hack the server or the infrastructure, just as I described for smart cards. And on to biometrics, the most common form of authentication on TV. Biometrics measure your body. This is often done with a fingerprint scanner or a retina scanner or just by showing a picture ID. Signatures are also a form of biometrics because all of our signatures are a little bit unique and none of us can really perfectly forge somebody's signature, though people get pretty good at it. I mean, the same thing comes up with picture IDs, right? Sometimes people look just like you and I guess they could impersonate you. Certainly every 19-year-old borrows her 22-year-old sister's ID so she can sneak into a bar, right? That's a biometric authentication attack. Biometrics have a huge advantage over passwords in that they're impossible to lose or forget. Well, I guess they're not impossible. You could lose your finger or your eye or something, but it doesn't happen as often as people forget their passwords, right? Biometrics are something you are, the third type of authentication, also known as characteristic-based authentication. Biometrics are pretty hard to implement. They require physical client authentication devices, so you need to have a fingerprint scanner on every device. They also require a specialized server that can store the characteristics of your fingerprint or your retina and compare it against whatever data it is that the authentication client spits out. So who here has an iPhone with a fingerprint scanner on it? What about a tablet PC or an Android device? Do you even have a PC with a fingerprint scanner on it? What about a Retina Scanner? How many of these do you see in use in your day-to-day life? Not on TV. Not many, right? Biometrics are really not very common, which is why I say they're the most common authentication type on TV, because that's really where you see them. They do exist. Retina scanners in particular are extremely reliable and very secure and very, very difficult to forge, but they are also really expensive, and you know what? People don't like them. They're really intrusive. So here are some examples of biometric devices. I've described all of these already, but you can see the two pictures on the right. The one on the top right is a retina scanner. It's taking a picture of the retina and then looking for little veins and other things inside the eye that are unique to us as an individual. The lower right there shows a fingerprint scanner, and you know what? You can see it has a number pad attached to it that allows the person to type a PIN, something you know and something you have. Now, biometric is a fairly unique type of authentication because you don't always need to have dual-factor authentication for biometrics because they're so difficult to forge. In other words, your retina scan provides a pretty high level of security. So why would you want to have both something you are and something you know authentication? Biometric attacks. We've seen this in movies too, right? You know, the super spy needs to get past the fingerprint scanner or the retina scanner. You know what the bad guy does, right? He cuts your finger off and he puts it in the fingerprint scanner. And that's not a good day for you. No, and really, if you're the one making the security decisions in your organization, I'm sure you don't want to be like, you know, I don't want anybody to get into my organization unless they're willing to cut an employee's finger off. That's no good. Realistically, there aren't too many people losing fingers to get past fingerprint scanners. It's not a common scenario, but modeling and mimicry are pretty common. You can get somebody's fingerprint and make a mold of it and put it on a fingerprint scanner. In fact, I've seen demos where inexpensive fingerprint scanners are tricked by a photocopy of somebody's fingerprint. So you lift their fingerprint, you dust it, you photocopy that onto a piece of paper so you just see the black and white outlines, and then you can just hold it up to the fingerprint scanner, and that will trick an awful lot of fingerprint scanners. You can also just grab a guy and be like, I'm going to put this knife inside of you unless you put your eye up to the retina scanner. We see that in movies all the time, and this is where the dual-factor authentication requirement comes in. If somebody's forcing you to put your finger up to the keypad or your eye up to the retina scanner, well, they'll give you a second PIN. That means, let me in, but call security right away. So you could just say, oh, I mistyped my PIN over and over again, but they're going to get increasingly angry at you and get a little more forceful. So what you do is you have your main PIN, which is what you use on a day-to-day basis, and then you have an emergency PIN. And you put that emergency PIN in, and it's something different. And when you put it in, it lets you in so they don't shoot you, but then it also calls security so they can come running and save the day. So in the world of biometrics, you have to start to worry about accuracy because it's not black and white. Like, if you mistype your password, you mistyped it. Passwords don't require you to get most of the letters right. Same thing with smart cards. It's not like if you have a similar smart card, it's going to let you through. Like, no authentication system is like, well, that's good enough, Tony. You just about got your password. I'm going to let you in. But biometrics are not an exact science. They don't measure exactly the same way. You and I were human beings, and our skin cells are flaking off, and we grow a little bit, or maybe we're aging and we're shrinking a little bit. This is the real world. Things can change based on the humidity and stuff that you have on your fingers. So biometrics have to accept some margin of error. They also have some false rejections and false acceptances, also called false negatives and false positives. So how often a biometric system incorrectly rejects a legitimate user is called the false rejection rate. It's called a type 1 error, and I want you to remember that for the exam. Wink! And how often they allow somebody in who's not a legitimate user is called a false acceptance rate. It's a type 2 error. So I could go up to a Retina scanner and it might let me through if I wasn't a legitimate user if my eye was really, really similar to somebody else. It doesn't happen so much with Retina scanners, but it does happen with fingerprints. So on these biometric devices, you can fine-tune the sensitivity. On a fingerprint scanner, you could make it very, very sensitive, in which case you'd have a lot of legitimate users going up and failing with their own fingerprint. You can also loosen it up a little bit so there aren't as many failures, but then you'd have some illegitimate users walking up, scanning their fingerprint, and the system would think they were somebody else because it would be like, close enough, I'm going to let you through. So you find this sweet spot between less sensitive and more sensitive, and this is considered the crossover error rate. And the crossover error rate is how we compare different biometric authentication mechanisms to each other. It basically speaks to how accurate and how useful any given biometric authentication mechanism is. So here's some common biometric authentication mechanisms listed in order from best CER to worst CER. Retinas have a crossover error rate of about 1 in 500,000. That's very, very, very accurate. The iris is also very accurate. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the difference between retina and iris scanning in a minute, but basically, retinas feel a little more intrusive and they're a little more accurate. Irises are very accurate, but a little less accurate, but they don't feel so intrusive to the user. Fingerprint scanning is not terribly accurate. It's kind of in the middle of this list, but I still think fingerprint scanning is not accurate enough for most organizations who need that level of security. Using both written and voice signatures are not that useful. They really aren't. You can impersonate somebody else's voice. It's also really easy to record and play back. And signatures are pretty easily forged. For that reason, they're at the bottom of the list and they're just not terribly useful. And in fact, I can't believe we use signature biometrics for things as important as credit cards and mortgages and everything else. We treat it like it's trustworthy. It's really not very trustworthy at all. I guess we don't really have the option of putting retina scanners in at every credit card kiosk. So to back up a little bit and talk about the difference between retina and iris scanners. Retina scanners are the most accurate type, but you have to put your eye right against the device for a retina scanner to work. And it feels weird. It feels like when you're at the eye doctor, you know, and this stuff is just like all up in your face, like touching against it. Imagine doing that every single time you went into your office. You got to go to the bathroom, you got to put your eye up against this thing, and everybody else is putting their eye up against this thing. People just aren't that comfortable with it. An iris scanner, you just have to get close to it. And it can check out your iris. And it's still very accurate. It's not nearly as accurate as retina scanners, but it's quite accurate, and you're not touching it. You don't have this thing pressed against your eye. So that's the compromise between retina and iris scanners, but understand that for the exam and for the real world that they each have compromises. There's no one answer. The greater security from the retina comes with a cost, and that's increased user inconvenience. And you know what? If people hate it too much, they're going to start like jamming the foot open with their door. They're going to hold the door open for the guy behind them, trying to like do him a favor so he doesn't have to press his eye against this device. And this goes back to what I talked about in the introduction to this course. Security is always a compromise. It's always shades of gray and never black and white. This is just another way to visualize the order. Think of these as little greater than symbols. Retinas are better than iris. Iris is better than fingerprint. Fingerprints are better than signature, and pretty much everything is better than voice. This is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and thanks so much for watching this video lesson.